Welcome to the presentation of the paper The Appropriateness of Prenuclear Accent Types, Evidence for Information Structural Effects by Stefan Baumann, that's me, Janina Kalbertodt, and Jane Mertens. So far, studies on the relationship between information structure and prosody usually concentrated on the role of nuclear accents, defined as the final and only obligatory pitch accent in an intonation unit. The assumption that the position of the nuclear accent is decisive for the correct pragmatic interpretation of an utterance can be shown by an example like this one by Beaver and Clark. In the first sentence, the nuclear accent is on teaching.
David only wears a bow tie when teaching.
Which means that teaching is the only situation in which David wears a bow tie. The second sentence has quite a different meaning.
David only wears a bow tie when teaching.
And it suggests that David wears nothing but a bow tie while he's teaching. In contrast to nuclear accents, prenuclear accents, that is, accents to the left of the nuclear accent, are sometimes said to be placed only for rhythmic reasons. That is, they are optional or ornamental, as is the case with David and wears in our example. However, there are a few studies that showed consistent placement of prenuclear accents, which varied in peak scaling and peak alignment, indicating meaning differences. So, the status of prenuclear accents is far less clear than the status of nuclear accents. Actually, in a recent production study on German, we found a positive correlation between informativeness, comprising information status and contrastive focus, and prosodic prominence in prenuclear position. Although there was an overall strong preference for rising prenuclear accents, we found an effect of informativeness on continuous phonetic cues. The newer the referent was, the steeper the rise. And this study forms the basis of the present perception study. In our study, we test whether differences in informativeness affect the perceptual appropriateness of specific accent types in prenuclear position in German, and also whether these effects depend on the mode of presentation. Our first hypothesis is a general preference for rising accents, since they were most frequent in our production data. Second, it has been found several times, especially for West Germanic languages, that specific accent types are particularly appropriate markers of certain levels of informativeness. Given items are often de-accented, accessible ones often carry a low accent, new items high accents, and contrastive items rising accents. And note that the perceived prosodic prominence of the accent types increase from left to right. In the studies mentioned here, these relations apply to nuclear accents, but we hypothesize that it also holds for prenuclear accents. Third, we hypothesize that auditorily presented items are stronger primes than visually presented ones, which means that we expect clearer results when the context to our target sentences are spoken and not just read silently. This is the structure of the stories we created, which were already used in the production study. Each story consists of 3 sentences. Context 1 introduces the setting. Context sentence 2 is varied in order to render the target noun phrase in the third sentence either given, accessible, new, or contrastive. And finally, we have a target sentence whose appropriateness in the context has to be judged by the participants. An example target sentence is "The nun watered an almond tree" in the English translation here, with the target word none. Let's go through an example story with the 4 conditions. The first context sentence sets the scene. Here, after the long winter, everybody was looking forward to a couple of sunny hours in the open. The second one, the nun was looking after the cloister garden, makes the target word textually given. So we would expect that de-accentuation of none is most appropriate. I will play the actual target stimuli in a minute. In the second condition, the none is made accessible due to the cloister garden scenario. We would expect that a low accent on none is most appropriate here. In the new condition, the target word is not derivable from the context. Actually, the context is neutral here. The sun had been shining all day and the snow had finally melted. Again, we would expect an accent on none, this time a higher one, a bit more prominent than in the accessible condition. Finally, the contrastive condition elicits a double focus between the monk and the nun on the one hand, and between the blackberry bush and the almond tree on the other. So the nun is hypothesized to be most prominent here, so that a rising accent seems to be appropriate. 16 stories were produced by a trained native speaker of Standard German. The target sentences were read with 5 different tonal contours on the prenuclear referent, while the nuclear part was kept constant. The recorded material was manipulated in part in order to guarantee that the Hertz values for the respective accent types were exactly the same in each story. And here you can see the stylized contours of the target sentences, annotated with G-Toby accent types. In number 1, we have a de-accentuation of the target word die Nonne, or the nun.
Die Nonne hat einen Mandelbaum gegossen.
In 2, we have a low accent on this word.
Die Nonne hat einen Mandelbaum gegossen.
In 3, a high accent.
Die Nonne hat einen Mandelbaum gegossen.
In 4, we have a later rise, a low star plus high.
Die Nonne hat einen Mandelbaum gegossen.
And finally, in 5, an earlier rise, that is a low plus high star.
Die Nonne hat einen Mandelbaum gegossen.
We conducted 2 experiments with 52 subjects each. That is, we had 2 totally different sets of subjects. In the first experiment, participants could listen to the recorded context and to the target sentences. Whereas in experiment 2, the participants silently read the context before they judged the appropriateness of the auditorily presented target sentence. The task was always, how well does the target sentences match the context in which they are presented? And the appropriateness ratings were done via a slider bar, ranging from very bad match to a very good match. Let's turn to the results now. Hypothesis 1, that is, that there is a general preference for rising accents, is partly confirmed. And this is since low star plus high is preferred for all conditions, as it reaches the overall highest appropriateness ratings. As mentioned earlier, low star plus high also was the most frequent accent type in the production data. The least preferred accent type was high star, for all conditions except in the newness condition. Hypothesis 2 was partly confirmed as well, in that we found an interaction of informativeness and accent type that influenced the appropriateness ratings. The linear mixed effects analysis clearly confirms this interaction. As expected, de-accentuation was judged as most appropriate for given reference, and for marking accessible reference, the low accent, L star, was preferred, but also the 2 rising accent types. Actually, the sequence of low star plus high star from the prenuclear to the nuclear region is a rising contour as well, but with a shallower rise. The same selection of rising accents, including the combination of a low prenuclear accent and a high nuclear accent, was most appropriate for contrastive reference, but here the effect was stronger than for accessible reference. Interestingly, new reference received the lowest appropriateness ratings for each accent type. And a possible explanation for this pattern is that listeners generally disprefer an out-of-the-blue introduction of new reference, especially in comparison with the other versions which were embedded in a more plausible context. The third hypothesis was not confirmed, since the type of stimulus presentation, that is auditory versus visual, did not significantly affect the appropriateness ratings. Nevertheless, there was a tendency to judge accents, and especially the lack of an accent, as less appropriate for contrastive items after they were auditorily presented. And this, we think, suggests that echoic memory might play a role here. In the contrastive context sentence, the sentence initial referent carried a prominent low star plus high accent, which primes the expectation of the same prenuclear accent type on the target word. And this is why de-accentuation on this item is less appropriate than in the silent reading condition, where there is no auditory priming. To conclude, our results mirror the findings of an earlier production study on prenuclear accents using the same stories. In general, there's a preference for rising accent types in prenuclear position, as we expected, but we also find subtle effects of informativeness. Listeners clearly prefer de-accentuation and low accents on given reference, whereas rising accents are favored for reference in a contrastive context. Furthermore, the effects of informativeness are independent of the mode of context presentation. That is, silent reading did not significantly alter the appropriateness judgments of accent types. So these findings once more challenge the view of prenuclear accents as being merely ornamental and rather suggest that they are sensitive to changes in information structure. Thanks a lot for your attention. Finally, here's a list of the relevant references. And if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to send me a mail. So thanks again, and goodbye for now.